27 years ago, all eyes were upon Eastern European countries as the repressive, technocratic, Stalinist governments crumbled one after another. Today, we have politicians such as the German president talking about dark Europe, which has become a code word for Eastern Europe. We have debates as to whether countries like Hungary or Poland should remain within the European Union because of their undemocratic governments. And this is what we want to talk about this afternoon. The question is, are we experiencing a new cultural war? Does this have to do with Eastern Europe, or does this have to do as much with what's going on, what's happening in the West at the moment? My name is Sabine Beppler-Spahl, by the way. I'm chair of a German institute called Freiblickinstitut, which was founded 1.5 years ago to enable open and democratic debates, modeled a little bit on the Battle of Ideas, which I'm very, very pleased to be at. But we've got a wonderful panel here today, and I'm going to introduce the speakers in the order that they'll be speaking. I'm going to start off with Joan Hoey. She's regional manager in the European team of the Economist Intelligence Unit, the business information arm of the Economist Group. She specializes in the politics and economics of Greece, the Balkans, and Eastern Europe. She's also editor of the EIU's annual Democracy Index, and we're very, very pleased to have her here today. Our second speaker is on the far right of this table, is Peter Ungar. He studied geography in Edinburgh University, then at the Central European University, and is currently a doctorate candidate in the University of Budapest. He won an essay competition on Antal Joseph, the first democratically elected Prime Minister of Hungary, and he has also published widely in several international newspapers. He's also been elected to serve as the executive committee or on the executive committee of the European Green Party. Our third speaker is Dr. Łukasz Pawłowski. He's managing editor and columnist at Kultura Liberalna. I'm sure I pronounced that completely wrongly.
No, it's good.
And he holds a PhD in social sciences. He started working as a journalist in 2008 for the second largest Polish broadsheet paper and was awarded the 2014 National Bank of Poland Annual Award for the best interviewer in economics. And our final speaker, last but certainly not least, is Professor Ivan Krastev. He's chairman of the Center for Liberal Strategies in Sofia and permanent fellow at the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. He's also a founding board member of the European Council on Foreign Relations. He has published several books, one of them, Democracy Disrupted, which I've just read and can highly recommend to anybody who's interested in Eastern Europe. He's also co-author with Stephen Holmes of a forthcoming book on Russian politics. So I'll pass the word on without much to do to Joan.
Thank you very much, Sabina. So is there a cultural war in Europe between East and West? No doubt about it. I think there is one. EU politicians, media, academic commentators talking and writing about that conflict as one between liberal democracy as represented by the EU and illiberal democracy or populist authoritarianism as represented and proclaimed by Viktor Orban in Hungary and Jarosław Kaczynski in Poland, and indeed by Vladimir Putin, who talks about a civilizational war between Russia and the West. And this discourse has been going on for some years now and has become increasingly prominent in parallel with the increasing populist challenge to the political order in Europe since 2014. Now, in this discourse, the EU's liberal democracy is always assumed, never defined, but receives negative affirmation by contrasting it with the values espoused by Orban, Kaczynski, Putin, and co., and in particular, their embrace of traditional values such as Christianity, the family, the nation, and their emphasis on national sovereignty and the importance of borders. So what does this represent? Why is it happening now? What are the main drivers of this? In the West, the cultural war against the East is being driven, I would say, as much by the problems facing Western elites as anything that is happening in Eastern Europe. The inability of EU elites to provide compelling arguments about what Europe stands for the absence of a set of shared beliefs and values around which to unite society leads inexorably to the search for a negative counterpoint. And that's actually been the case since the collapse of the Soviet bloc, which for 50 years provided a fig leaf for Western rulers who found it difficult to provide a positive moral case for capitalism. But it's also, I would say, about more than that. The desire to isolate Hungary and Poland and their present rulers expresses anxieties of elites who are facing a growing revolt within their own societies against the political status quo, as epitomized by the rise of populism in the West in recent years. And this culture war started a long time before Viktor Orban declared his countercultural revolution against Brussels. The process of eastward enlargement, EU membership for the East European states, was premised on the assumption that these former communist Eastern Bloc countries needed to be civilized in the values of the enlightened EU. Hence, the adoption of the acquis by the new member states was not simply about proving that they were functioning market economies and functioning democracies. They also had to demonstrate that they shared the West's social and cultural values too. What's different today is that the politicians in Eastern Europe, and particularly disturbing, I think, for the West in Central Europe, are increasingly calling into question values which we are told cannot be questioned, which are inviolable and the bedrock of Western civilization, and the only thing indeed standing between us and a return to authoritarianism or even totalitarianism. Now, the West is not imagining this countercultural revolt against EU values in the East. It's being proclaimed as such by Orban and Kaczynski. So what's that all about? A lot of things that are happening in Eastern Europe, I would say, are a more extreme version of what is happening in Western Europe, and that's been the case. A lot of the political problems, that's been the case for a long, long time. It predates the 2008 crisis. It was evident even at the height of the growth boom in Eastern Europe. So, first of all, I would say we shouldn't endow these two with too much significance or coherence. They've been made into bogeymen by Western media and politicians. There's a big difference between an opportunist politician such as Orban and a committed ideologue such as Kaczynski, who says that it's Catholicism or nihilism. Orban at the moment is driven partly by a desire to outflank Jobbik on the far right. Kaczynski wants to establish a conservative Catholic state, which is a very particular thing, I would say. And Orban's come a long way since his early days. When I first visited his offices in the early 1990s, when he was pro-EU, pro-Western, pro-democracy, pro-free market, there was quite a shift has taken place there, in particular between 94 and 98, when he shifted his party to the right. In 98, the EIU was banned from Hungary for 2 years after we called him a populist. Then he had a very thin skin. It's become thicker since then, and now he very much relishes being called a populist and a dictator by Mr. Juncker and others in Brussels. So there's also very big differences between the Visegrad Four, between Poland and Hungary on the one hand and the Czech Republic and Slovakia on the other. They agree on rejecting migrant quotas, but they in the Czech Republic and Slovakia feet, so they reject some elements of this countercultural revolution. They also disagree about Russia. Hungary and Slovakia are more pro-Russian. The others, Poland is obviously anti-Russian, Czech Republic somewhere in between, Slovakia is in the Eurozone. So there's lots of difference. And I would say that Poland and Hungary are against the EU, but not in a Eurosceptic sense. There is a paradox that support for the EU is stronger in Hungary and Poland than any other member state. That's according to Europe. I mean, this may have changed or may be changing, but Eurobarometer polls show that 72% of Poles, 61% of Hungarians support the EU. 2/3 of Hungarians support either Fidesz or Jobbik. So, let's explain that paradox maybe. There's an ambivalence. They want to have their cake and eat it. They're the biggest recipients of EU funds and value very highly free movement of people within the EU. They don't have the courage of their convictions on the question of national sovereignty and defending it, otherwise they would leave the EU or campaign for that. Beyond the Visegráds, the other 9 EU member states that joined the EU in 2004, 2007 and 2013, Croatia being the latest, are pro-EU. The Western Balkans aspirant member states still see the EU as the only game in town. Nevertheless, it's possible to discern some weakening of support for the EU, and there's no doubt that Britain's decision to leave was a big shock in the region. So, we can recognise the limited character of this self-proclaimed countercultural revolution, but what's driving it, I would say, is several things. First of all, it is symptomatic of the waning appeal of the EU project, post-crisis, post-Brexit, and so on. They never bought into this socially liberal, multicultural, relativist values foisted on them during the accession process. As the EU itself is assailed by doubts and problems, there's room for Eastern member states to be more assertive. The Visegráds are more coherent states, more successful economically, and after some difficult years following the crisis, more confident of pursuing their interests. So I think the key thing was the migrant crisis and the EU reaction, especially the migrant quotas diktat, which was a turning point in galvanizing the Visegráds led by Hungary and Poland, and brought out into the open these differences which had always been there over borders, culture, values, and so on. So that anti-democratic dictatorial bludgeoning of the Central Europeans on the quotas issue generated a strong reaction, unlike previous conflicts over budgets and bailouts. So just to finish, I think also quite important really in understanding what is going on in the region, this recent assertiveness, at least instinctively, is born of an understanding that the authority and legitimacy of political elites depends on their ability to provide a national narrative, a vision, some sense of identity. And what's striking about Eastern Europe, as I said, even during the boom years of 2004 to 2008, was the political malaise. Pew, Gallup, Life in Transition Survey, all these polls showed that deep popular dissatisfaction with the workings of democracy. And 27 years after the fall of communism, capitalism, or what we have now in place in this region, has not managed to fill the moral or ideological vacuum that's been left behind. Just finally, I don't think that this represents any kind of geopolitical war or challenge. I think that it's relatively insignificant, not insignificant, that's not true. It is very important, and we can see how clashes over values have the potential to lead to quite serious conflicts. Much more important maybe is the culture war between the West and Russia. A confrontation that is posed in cultural existential terms can spiral out of control in geopolitical and military terms, but that's another discussion, probably.
All right, so we'll leave that to another time then. Peter.
Thank you very much. I would like to pick up very much where the previous speaker left off. I think that the reason that this, and very aptly titled session, is the Eastern Menace is because Eastern Europe, especially the leaders that were mentioned earlier, and I would very much call him by his name, Fico, the Prime Minister of Slovakia, it also fits into this mold quite well, is a menace because it shows very much the crumbling neoliberal, the idea of neoliberal progress that has been put upon Eastern Europe post-system change. So I think the fact that this is crumbling is very much shown about how the Hungarian, the Slovakian, very much the Croatian, and to a lesser extent the Romanian electorate has voted in the last couple of years. I mean, I think we could divide this neoliberal consensus into two ways, as was done previously. One in a kind of idea of economic progress, which meant that these countries should aspire to large FDI, low wages, and very low state spending, and the destruction of the welfare state as a machine to counter economic inequality, and an idea of social progress with Western European kind of identity politics, gay marriage, democracy, the term racism suddenly appeared in Eastern Europe as something that would describe the situation of the Roma minority. And this idea, neoliberal consensus, this idea that there is progress, is best phrased by this word we have in Hungarian, and we also have in Slovakian, and they use this in Croatia. I'm not sure about the other countries in the region, called the convergence, the idea of convergence. So this is the idea that through following these steps I have talked about, we can converge into being just like Western Europe, that finally they will teach us how to eat us with a knife and a fork. We can be like one of them, and we will converge into being Western Europeans. Now, what Orban does with this convergence is he keeps the economic part of it. So if we look at the economics of the Orban government, that twice was elected with a supermajority, it is a fundamentally neoliberal government. There are some instances of populist moves, like the state cap on the heating price, and there are some instances of populism, but fundamentally Orban is a Thatcherite. He always was. This is, I think, the one thing in which he hasn't changed since 1990, and it is a neoliberal government. This is, I think, very true of the previous Polish government, the one that was just ousted, the one of the Civic Platform, and it is, in a certain respect, very true of the Croatian right, which might get in, or it's a very sticky situation there. So, but this he keeps of the consensus. What he doesn't keep of the consensus is the social aspect. He says we are against this. He says we do not only not do this, we do the exact opposite of it. And the reason he does it is because the way he phrases political statements and the way in which most of these leaders phrase political statements is by choosing an enemy. And Brussels has been a very easy enemy. And I'll talk about why that is. There are two issues why that is. Number one, this constant hissy fit, the European Parliament, through every time Hungary passed a law about media or the Constitutional Court. And this was important for Poland as well, because Hungary was the first one to do these kind of laws, proved how ineffectual and how weak the European response is. Nothing happened. They couldn't make him change anything other than the Venice Commission made him change, I think, 2 minor laws. Nobody even knows Hungary what they were exactly. So there was no real power. There was no real power issue in this. He could do whatever he wanted. So this is number one, why it was an easy enemy. Number two is because the people that were representing the European Union in the eyes of the Hungarian public, and I think we can call their names as well, mainly Jean-Claude Juncker, hasn't been exactly one of the people that is most easily, is not very convincing for the Hungarian public, to put it mildly. So I think that what happened in this way, the consensus, basically he said the consensus no longer exists. This is what his famous speech on illiberal democracy was about. That speech, I think the main point of that speech was that the consensus is dead. He said something that has been happening for a very long time, and I think throughout the continent, and he said that very purposefully. Why I'm his opposition is that I think he keeps the consensus in what he should have changed it in, and he changed it in what he should have kept it in. So I think the economic consensus should have been one that should have been ruined. This neoliberal idea of the Hungarian and the Eastern European convergence to Europe through the Maastricht mechanism and all these horrible budgetary stuff, this is what should have been ruined. He's very right not to institute the euro, but it should have been kept in many of the social issues. It isn't. And I want to just come back to one last point, the point of geopolitics. I think geopolitics play a huge role in this. This whole idea of the traditional Christian nation, again, this is not true of Poland, but of Slovakia, Croatia, and Hungary very much, is funded by Putin and Putin's people. These people are waging a war against women's reproductive rights. Well, they haven't gone to the full conclusion yet in Hungary, then they probably won't, because Orban is an opportunist and Hungarian people support the right to abortion. But what I want to state is that these people support this. On the other hand, there is another geopolitical actor, which is certain foundations that claim to represent a kind of identity politics type of very neoliberal social change in Hungary. And these two are what is pushing the Hungarian discourse in a way that you cannot phrase anything else other than what your relationship is to Orban. Now, making Orban the boogeyman, just my last point, this has helped him very much because it made him appear in Hungary as someone who's a major player in the world stage. This is, to some extent, true of Fico. And this helps them kind of mask over the interior problems of income inequality and put their whole political agenda into this a large battle of cultures, or these large battle of world powers, where it is actually only driven by the interior politics. Thank you.
Right. Thank you very much. Łukasz.
Thank you very much. Thank you for inviting me. I'll go straight to the country which I know most about, which is obviously Poland. I think I have a slightly different opinion than my predecessors, because I think that sometimes the reality is much simpler. So first, I want to make three points. First, PIS, which is Law and Justice Party, the governing party in Poland. PIS's electoral success last year was not as big as one may think, and it does not necessarily signify any major social change. PIS received 37.5% of the vote, which is 7.5% more than it received 4 years before. This is a significant gain, but it's hardly a sign of some fundamental social revolution. It is also not the highest number, the highest support that the party in Poland has ever received in the last 25 years. PIS, this is the first point. The second point, PIS is a party incapable of governing in the long run, due to a number of reasons. First of all, it is personally managed by its leader, Jarosław Kaczyński, to the points that you would find unimaginable. So it's not governable. You cannot run a party which is in government like this. You cannot rule it personally. You cannot oversee every aspect of government. I can get into details if you want me to later, but that's the point. Secondly, it will fall victim to its own ambitions and its own promises, which it won't be able to fulfill. In the last electoral campaign, PIS applied the same strategy as many other populist movements apply around the globe. So after painting a dark picture of the country, the party explained all of the Poland's ills were the fault of the so-called ruling elite, or the pact, as Kaczyński calls it, which remained in power for the last 25 years. So from this diagnosis, it followed that radical steps need to be taken in order to put the country back on track. So already during the campaign, the future prime minister came up with a number of policy proposals which were allegedly ready to be implemented right after the elections. Those included lowering the retirement age, introducing free medications for people over 75, lowering VAT tax rates, and launching a social program of financial support for families of 4 and more. A year later, only the last of these promises, the child support social program for families of 4 and more, was introduced and put a great strain on an already tight budget. So the government is running out of money after introducing one reform. What is more, the new policy proposals which they came up with after the election are met with resistance, which may result in conflicts with many social groups, including teachers, junior doctors, or women who are against introducing new anti-abortion laws. You might have heard there were huge protests in Poland against restricting the abortion laws, which are already very strict. So after a year in power, support for peace is much lower, if you look at the polls, is much lower than it was for the previous government after 5 years in power. So in my view, PIS might not even make it till the end of the term. Not only some people believe that they might govern even 2 terms, I think they won't make it till the end of this one. However, PIS time in power will obviously have negative consequences for Poland, and the one I fear most is what we were talking about, that the old Europe will once again have a perfect excuse not to treat Poland as a partner, as the same country, the same as those in the West. So only recently, probably the future president of France, Alain Juppé, said that the European Union should be renewed by the countries which share European values, and he said that Poland and Hungary probably do not belong to this group due to their attitude towards refugee crisis and abortion laws. And obviously, he is fighting his own battles over there, but the fact that he was able to say those things and was not met with any, didn't meet any consequences, is very significant. Radosław Sikorski, the former foreign minister of Poland, has recently said that his major goal during 7 years in office was to convince the countries of Western Europe that Poland is one of them, and that any sacrifice made for Warsaw is equivalent to a sacrifice Europe would make for Paris, London, Berlin, Madrid, or whatever. Today, however, this effort is constantly being undermined because PIS does not, in fact, believe that Poland is a part of the West. When I interviewed the Polish president's spokesperson, Marek Magierowski, he told me that we will always, here I quote, we will always be an Eastern country. I fundamentally disagree with this view, and I'm afraid of possible consequences. In fact, even the way this panel is described shows a shift in a view on Poland and the rest of the Central Europe. So this, I believe, is the worst that can happen, this change of perception, because as one of my friends once said, every meter further away from Brussels, in case of Poland, is a kilometer closer to Moscow. So you might ask at this point if those people who are in power in Poland are so bad as I just described, how the hell did they got to win the elections? And I'm happy to answer that question later on, but I don't think I'm going to make it in this round.
Oh, thanks a lot. Ivan.
Thank you very much. Thanks. Let's start with the old joke from many years ago. It's December 1968. A Czech person walking on the street late at night, and he sees somebody who is roaming on the street. He goes next to him and said, "Comrade, I share your analysis." And I do believe that part of the problem with the talks about Eastern Europe, and this is also part of the framing, is that if 25 years ago the idea was that the future of Eastern Europe is going to resemble something of the West, now many in the West has the fear that the future of Western Europe is going to resemble Eastern Europe. Because many of the problems that basically Eastern Europe and Western Europe are facing, you can see within the Western societies themselves. So I'm going just to make 3 points trying to see where basically the major tension came and how they started. One, of course, was the migration crisis. Western societies have been divided on the migration issues. East European societies have been united. The anti-refugee consensus in all of East European countries was overwhelming. And for many, this came as a major surprise for 3 reasons. First, they said, listen, but these people are migrating themselves. London being one of the examples. Secondly, there was not much migrants that want to stay in our countries. And thirdly, most of these countries basically has a history of dealing with refugees and migrants in their history. So this was such a strong cultural shock. It was not simply the policies, and this is now, we are not talking about governments. This is very important. It's not about Orban or Kaczynski or any of them. It was a very strong social consensus. It was very much consensus from below. And I do believe it's quite important to understand this divide, because part of this divide is something that makes basically the West so nervous of certain people in the West. Here, you should go back to history and keep in mind that most of East European states came after the Second World War as a result of ethnic cleansing, and many of them feel all this multiculturalism as a security threat. Poland now has 95% population of Poles. It was not the case in 1939. 1/3 of the population had been Germans, Jews, Ukrainians. The second is demography. We are talking about the small nations which very much fear disappearing. And certainly this is a major mistrust towards the capacity of their institutions to integrate anybody. And from this point of view, the failure of integrating the Roma communities became a critically important. The idea is why these states that didn't manage to integrate Roma communities that have been there forever are going to succeed this. I'm saying this because basically this is when history comes, and history comes not because of one of a populist leader trying to manipulate here and there. And of course, all of the leaders in the region managed to make sense of this, but it was not a consensus created from above. The second strange thing about the region, and here Poland is a great case, people try to explain the rise of the populist parties and populist governments because of the economic issues, because of the economic crisis. And by the way, in Hungary, it has a lot of relevance, and there are many countries in which it has a relevance. Poland does not fit it. Poland went through the economic crisis basically untouched. For the last 10 years, Poland was the best economic performer in the European Union. And even when people talk about social inequality, for the last 5 years, social inequality in Poland was declining and not increasing, talking about the Gini coefficient. So from this point of view, the strange question about a country like Poland is, why a society which is so pro-European, according to all polls, by the way, the latest ones, voted for a party which is openly Eurosceptical? And secondly, why Poles who do not trust politicians decided to give the power to one person and one party, and basically were not surprised to see that they tried to dismantle check and balances. And here is basically part of the explanation that I want to give to you so we can discuss. If you try to understand some of the populist governments in Eastern Europe, think in terms of a second generation of migrants. The first generation, people like Havel, Geremek, and others, they came, and for them success was very much try to show that they're more European than Europeans. For the second generation, many of this imitation of institutions and others starts to be experienced as humiliation. The idea of the return of the traditional culture and basically our differences become politically very important. Nevertheless, that these people in a way are much more Europeanized than the previous generation. I'm saying this because according to the political theory, the separation of powers is the way to control the elites. For many people on the street, the separation of power started to be viewed as the excuse of the governments not to deliver of what they have promised. The governments are saying we cannot do this because of the courts, we cannot do this because of Brussels, we cannot do it. It became a competition in impotence. Basically, the most important for the government is to basically convince others that they're so impotent that you cannot ask anything from them. And from this point of view, for people, paradoxically, the only way to believe that they can control something is to give the power to somebody. The problem is that when you're giving this power, you're never sure is he's going to return it back to you on the next elections. And the last point, and this is, I'm just going to put this as a question in order that we're going to have a time to discuss. The interesting and really totally not discussed question about Eastern Europe is not what the populist governments are doing, and even not why they were elected, but why the opposition is so weak. For me, this is the interesting question, and I do believe I'll be very much happy to discuss it in the next time. Yeah.
I think there was some very, very interesting, I think all four speeches were very, very interesting. I think there's one thing which I noticed is that at least three of you, except for Ivan, sort of mentioned the point that there is a certain interest in keeping tensions up between West and East. So perhaps as a replacement of the old Cold War struggles. You said it gives the West the best excuse to treat Poland as it's always treated Poland. And I was wondering if that's true, or if we're seeing something completely new, and whether we might be overstating the kind of, the new Iron Curtain which we're seeing. So Junkers isn't particularly popular in Germany either, by the way, while Orban, by the way, is, in certain spheres of the population. So these are the kind of things I'd like to talk about. But I've seen one hand, so.
Thank you. Two questions to the panel. First one, I'm reminded of a wonderful little piece I saw recently that Ivan wrote about Brexit impact on Eastern Europe, and he drew the parallel with that wonderful book, Radetzky March, by Roth, in which after Franz Ferdinand is assassinated in Sarajevo on June 28th, 1914, a Hungarian mutters in Hungarian, "The bastard is dead," and that's the end. So the impact now in Eastern Europe, that Eastern Europeans realize this is the end of the EU. Now, is that true? And just generally, what do the panelists think the impact of Brexit will be? My second question refers to something I think only two of the speakers mentioned, just very briefly, Russia, which really, it seems to me at the moment, one of the very, very big issues, the Russian-Western conflict. And okay, you can always argue about the themes chosen at the battle of ideas. And, I don't want to say that some of the, in comparison, themes are not serious or flippant, though I could cite about a dozen if you push me, but I won't. But certainly, I think there's agreement that this issues of war and peace must be one of the big issues. And on this, I just wondered to what extent the panelists would sort of include it in the general discussion of a conflict of culture war, conflict of values, or is that really secondary to much harder issues that inform the Russia-US, Russia-Western conflict? And just last word on this, in quite a few of the sessions here over the 2 days, there's been a lot of Trump bashing, whereas I personally actually am quite concerned and frightened should Hillary, the big hawk, come to power and, basically start World War III. Thank you very much.
First of all, I'd like to ask all the panel whether we really can talk about Eastern Europe. These are very different countries, very different histories. And is there not a tendency for us to sort of lump really quite distinct political systems and cultures and histories together? For example, I think that, by very limited experience, that some of those states do look very clearly towards the West, would define themselves in that way. But there are other parts of Eastern Europe, partly for questions of language and religion, that might think of themselves as in some sort of, Slavophile environment. And even the use of that language throws us back into the 19th century and 1848 and so on. Related to that, and it's partly related to the comments about war and peace, do you think that there are possibilities of regional conflicts? And since we're talking about Orban, who's become the sort of new Houthi in the region, are we looking at conflicts, for example, over the Hungarian minorities, the overturning of the post-1918 settlement, the Romanian question? There are all sorts of issues of nationality. And I suppose, in a sense, the sort of elephant in the room, as it were, is the national question in many of those areas. It is reviving, and how it's framed has often been discussed, certainly since the war in Yugoslavia. Is this just another variety of that issue?
When we talk about Eastern Europe, I'm always reminded of the fact that I believe Prague is actually west of Vienna. So it's as much a historical state of mind as geography. And also in these countries, I just think about, which has been touched on, is the alternatives. When we talk about Viktor Orban as a bogeyman, if he's taking votes from Jobbik, is that necessarily a bad thing? When Jobbik is probably the closest we've got in modern Europe to a genuinely fascist Nazi party. So that's one point. And also with Poland, my impression just from a distance was that with Civic Platform, you had a sort of Europeanized elite that had done very nicely, and a lot of ordinary people weren't benefiting, as summed up by the Sikorsky tapes, who, of course, was in the Bullingdon Club with our very own David Cameron.
A few short questions. One is whether we should, I completely accept the point that the countries are all very different, but on the other hand, do we need to include the former GDR into this discussion? Another question is, Peter, you talked about neoliberal, etc., and you mixed in that quite a lot of different issues, including economic issues. And by the way, I disagree with your analysis of the destruction of the welfare state. Being German myself, the German welfare state is pretty big. But also you included some social issues, including equality and gay marriage, all that into one big bucket. And I think that needs unpacking. And third, the question is, was the transition too fast? And that's why the opposition parties are non-existent or not very strong.
Okay, so we've got several questions. Joan, do you want to come back on any of them? Maybe what is Eastern Europe? By the way, we did include East Germany in our introduction to this session, and not only East Germany, but also Austria, which we consider to be Eastern Europe. So we can talk about that, right? So, Joan.
So you upgraded them.
Yes, we've upgraded them, that's right. Here we go.
There's some really interesting questions, so I won't be able to answer all of them now. On the question, is this something very new which you yourself asked, Sabine? Is it different from the old East-West divide, Cold War? Obviously, I think it is. I think what we're seeing now, and it's been quite a slow unraveling in a way. It's 27 years. But this new culture war, if we are happy to call it that, is the product of the collapse of the post-Cold War order. You know, it's obviously something very different, and the unraveling of politics as we have known it really since the Second World War. And nobody probably, some people did actually anticipate back in 1990 that what seemed like a victory for the capitalist West and the end of history and all the rest that we're familiar with, that some people did have a presentiment that actually this would store up lots of problems for the West and the political order. And like I say, it's taken quite a long time to unravel. And it's interesting that it became evident much sooner in Eastern Europe, the problems, than Western Europe. You know, that kind of political malaise was already so evident back in the early 2000s. And, you know, what we have today is, on the one hand, you have basically a morass in a lot of the region of politics, I would say. And on the other hand, you have all these kind of strongmen, authoritarian types. But definitely democracy, the political transition, which seemed to go so smoothly, unlike the economic one, actually under the surface has been extremely problematic, and everybody's still grappling with these problems. So all the things that we see here, very low levels of trust in institutions and parties, has been there for a very long time. Massive disconnect between these politicians and the population, very divided societies. Brexit impact, does it mean the end of the EU? I think this idea that somehow what's happened here in the UK, which is often what we got beforehand, is sui generis, you know, that it's, you know, obviously there was something very specific about the UK, that it always had one foot in, one foot out of Europe. But, you know, if you go beyond that, we can see that the forces driving the Brexit vote are so commonplace, you know, on the continent as well. So what happened here really is symptomatic of problems within the EU, which are quite profound. And my hunch is that Brexit can only accelerate that process, really, of unraveling. And these centrifugal forces are not going to go away, no matter how much Brussels tries to circle the wagons and you know, hold things together. The forces that are moving in the opposite direction are just too strong. What that means for Eastern Europe, that's been a big question. What does it mean for the Balkans, all these ones, you know, who want to still join the EU? Probably it's not going to make that much difference, because the enlargement process is just not really happening, and it's not happening over a kind of time frame that is, you know, very useful for anybody in that region. Governments in the Balkans are finding it increasingly difficult to justify this process, and increasingly questions are being asked about the enlargement process. So UK was hardly any more a champion of enlargement in the region. So I think, again, that process was already very, very problematic for this region. There's lots of other things that I'll come back for, don't we?
All right, then. Peter, yes, do you want to respond particularly?
I'll just mention a couple of questions very briefly, and I want to tie three things together. The issue of Brexit, this question about whether the transition was too fast, and why is the opposition a failure in Hungary, Slovakia, and to a large extent Croatia. I think these three are, the reason for this is that because I, for example, believe that this idea of a transition and the idea of the convergence to Western Europe is an idea that is false, that I don't want to converge to Western Europe. I don't want to be a Western Europe. I don't want Hungary to be a Western European nation, although geographically it can never be, but even discursively never to be a Western European nation. I think that is, and one of the fundamental reasons that is because there is no such thing as Western Europe. Western Europe has died in Brexit discursively in the eyes of the Hungarian. Where is the liberal progress? Who are on the right side of history if the majority of people voted to leave the European Union? So there is this theological idea that we can, if we don't pass this law about cutting the budget, then we'll miss the train of progress, which has its certain stops, and then it kind of finishes where, you know, we become Austria. Oh God. Then you know, that died. That idea died itself. The transition wasn't too fast. The transition was a lie. This is why this has happened. And I think the reason the opposition, and I'm talking as a member and politician of an opposition party, has failed is because we haven't talked about this. This is a taboo in the Hungarian left. Because the post-socialist parties, and this is actually true about then I think the whole region now, this is I think the most fundamental, is that the people who were ruling the communist or state socialist dictatorships became the biggest neoliberals. And at a snap in 1990, they suddenly realized that they had Moscow, which they had to copy-paste. Now they can copy-paste something else. And, you know, it's the same thing. We just changed the papers. So, you know, let's all privatize everything and do this whole idea of this. It's the same kind of Marxist teleological thing, but it's the other direction. And just one fundamental thing, I have to correct this because I think it's factually drastically wrong. Orbán being the new Horthy. So that is simply not true. I think the Hungarian minority in the neighboring countries has been largely, I think national minorities as such, largely not talked about in the European context, in the European institutions, which was a large issue, but also Orbán and Fico is like the greatest bromance in European politics, Slovakia and Hungary, Slovakia having one of the largest Hungarian ethnic minorities, so this will not happen. This is something that Foreign Affairs wrote a horrible article about for reasons unknown to me, but this is, I think, factually very inaccurate.
Okay. Look, one second. Łukasz, you seem to know quite well what the difference between West and East is, because you did express a sort of worry about Poland being looked at as an Eastern country again, which you said it wasn't. By the way, there is a very strong group in the West who would say the same you're saying. So it's being very, very disappointed with Western values of progress, of growth. So there might be some much more alliance than you think between certain Western groups. But anyway, so Łukasz, what would you say about that?
Okay, there is obviously the West is grappling with serious problems on its own. I was talking about being seen and being treated as part of the same group. So this is more a political issue. If there is a conversation in Europe about how to change the EU and how to move forward, then there is the question whether you are part of the conversation or whether you are from the start being treated as somebody who's signed themselves out of the club or decided to leave the club. And the way the Eastern Europe is treated right now, is seen as different, is, in my opinion, very worrying. Because if you look at those programs of this party, I don't think they have any better alternative for those countries. I think, and I have to admit with sadness, that Poland, for example, Polish foreign policy, we don't have a very strong hand. We are not playing very strong hands. So we have a simple choice. It's either East or West. For me, the choice is quite. The answer to that dilemma is quite simple. So when Peter says that he doesn't want to be a part, or he doesn't want to be a part of the Western Europe, I don't really understand that, because I'm well aware that Britain is not Spain and Germany is not Italy. I see the differences. But the way they approach each other and see each other as a part of the same club, that's what I mean. Civic platform. There was a question I wanted to address. You said that maybe the change in Poland, the political change, was caused by the fact that not all of the people benefited from the transition from communist to democracy. That's obviously true, but if you look at the statistics that Ivan mentioned, it's hard to defend this claim because it's really the differences, the inequality, income inequality is simply not rising. So I don't know how to answer the question differently. I like the comparison Ivan made. It's like second-generation migrants. So it's not that the people are worse off now than they were 25 years ago, but the point of reference has changed. So you no longer look to Hungary, for example, which was quite affluent during the communist times in comparison to Poland, but you look to Germany or to Britain. And you are frustrating that you don't have the same stuff that people here do. And it's the second kind of second-generation migrants, I guess, can feel more or less the same. And I would argue also, is the third and last point, that the electoral result in Poland was, to some extent, bad luck or good luck, whatever your perspective, or bad luck for the country. Because first, why the PIS won the elections? Kaczynski understood that to win the elections and to have the majority, you don't really need the support of the majority of the electorate. Given the declining turnout in the elections, what you really need is about 20% of the people to vote for you to have the majority in parliament. And that's what he achieved. In Poland, the turnout is around 50%. So over the years, he built a core block of radical supporters, and during the elections, he slightly changed the language, showed a more benign face of the party by presenting allegedly more moderate politicians. So he had it both ways, and it was enough to get 39% of the vote. It was also the time, as you mentioned, that Platforma Obywatelska, the previous governing party, was in power for 8 years. So people get bored with the ruling party. And it was obviously also a bad luck for the previous government that Donald Tusk decided to leave Poland and go to become the president of the European Council. And he left the party in a mess, with a leader with with a successor with no political charisma. And on top of that, Kaczynski was simply lucky. If you look at the election results, due to the fact that only 5 parties made it through the 5% threshold you need to cross in order to get to parliament, the allocation of parliamentary seats was very favorable to the winner. So despite the fact that the PIS got less percent of the vote than Platforma 4 years before, it got a majority government. So I really cannot agree with the statement that there is some fundamental revolution going on in Eastern Europe. I agree that there are some problems that the whole continent is facing, but this is a slightly different discussion.
Okay, Ivan, do you want to say something quickly on this? Because you also mentioned multiculturalism, immigration. Joan also said the East was supposed to take on the social values of the West. Maybe the West doesn't have clear social values. Maybe you want to go back.
No, but there's 3 questions which I want to address.
Okay.
One is on disintegration and how the Brexit was perceived differently. There is one major difference between East and West, which is not based in a deep culture, but is based in personal experience. People in Eastern Europe have seen a political system collapsing in front of their eyes. And this system was perceived as very stable in many places. In Bulgaria, it was like nature. So from this point of view, we have a totally different sense of fragility of everything political. So from this point of view, in Eastern Europe, it's not so much Euroscepticism, but Europessimism. It's not that we want European Union to go bad, but we fear that this is going to happen. And from this point of view, Brexit has a very important impact. Plus, Brexit, in a certain way, made a gift the democracy and self-government discourse to the populist parties. Because you can basically blame Brits for everything, but you cannot take the democratic tradition out of them. And this is a major change, also on a discursive level. On the level of Russia, and being Bulgarian, I should respond. And this is the best substitute, you don't have a Russian. So I do believe it's quite important, and I share some of your fears, but let's make it clear. Cold War, you famous this formula MET, mutually assured destruction. But mutually assured destruction was based on the nuclear weapons which were disciplining the world. Now you have a different version of MET, mutually assured disruption. Everybody tries to basically show that he can create the domestic problems. Because, of course, I don't believe that in Moscow they have the illusion that they can decide the American elections, but you can show that you can create a mess. And this is problematic because it means that now it's domestic politics. And it is much more difficult to deal with the issue being domestic politics. Here comes, and I really try to be very... Hillary could be a problem, to be honest. Trump could be a problem in the American-Russian relations too. He so much praised President Putin that he believes that Putin owes him something. As a result of it, in the Trump's imagination, basically Russia is an ally against China. In the Russian imagination, this cannot happen. So 3 months later, if Trump is going to be elected, he'll go to Putin and say, let's do it. He's going to say no. And knowing how sensitive Mr. Trump is, I do believe that we can end up with a much higher level of a political tensions than basically with Clinton. Nevertheless, how hawkish she is. And on Vienna, this is just a joke, to be honest. Vienna basically managed, and I mean Austrians, to adopt some of these European practices. For example, now they're going to elect a president on the third round, like the Ukrainians. And they basically succeeded to move the date of the third round, what the Macedonians normally do. So from this point of view, we have a best practices exchange all over.
Right. Okay, so it's, can I see more hands? Yeah, there's one in the back there.
I had two questions. The first is, why has the impact of Russian involvement in eastern Ukraine not had a more terrifying effect on some of the Eastern European countries we've been discussing in terms of directing them more towards Brussels? I would have it strikes me as being a little bit strange as we've seen active Russian involvement in a foreign country, that would have been a bit more scary. And the second is, I notice that throughout this discussion we've not spoken about the Baltic countries, and I just wondered why people on the panel felt that that may be a different situation. I appreciate there are some historical differences, but why in particular that we haven't seen that same reaction that we have in some of the other countries so far? Thank you very much.
Okay, that's an interesting question. I'll just say one thing, coming from Germany. If you look at the German protesters, the Pegida protesters, the person they hold up in their banners is Vladimir Putin. So they love Putin. So that's an interesting thing, yeah.
Yeah, to this question of why isn't there opposition, I think one of the problems, I mean, you can see it most clearly in a country like Croatia, where it's had masses of intervention, and essentially what's happened is that civil society organisations or embryonic movements have experienced the NGOisation and a sort of dead end in terms of personal careers, and then what happens is it becomes, all the activism becomes about grant capture. So you have that problem. The other aspect in terms of it is precisely because we're talking about cultural wars in key respects, that opposition often takes cultural forms, and particularly in terms of, so it's highly prominent in terms of social media, etc., and some great sort of embryonic initiatives. But what you see again, that it's very much takes individualised forms, and then what happens later on, actually, individuals if they don't end up in terms of a sort of NGOisation in countries like such as Croatia, what happens is they take individual migration strategies, and that's again the solution. So although that involves some social cooperation, everybody knows where the best place is when you're starting off. If you're from Osijek and you want to go to Dublin, you know where the best places are to start out factory work and where to stay, etc., etc. There is some social coordination there, but it doesn't make for a collective political opposition. I think just on the question about Russia, I think the interesting thing, I think, in terms of Russia for many in the region is how Russia presents itself as a traditional security power and speaks to those traditional concerns. So whereas the West has, in key respects, has offered Croatia or Serbia or Bosnia, has offered them NGOs as a solution to economic problems, Russia has simply gone about building energy pipelines, etc., etc. And so I think what we should highlight is in terms of Croatia, is the surprising degree of lack of antipathy towards Russia, given that Russia is traditionally seen as an ally of Serbia. But it's again, I think, linked to the way that, well, we might not like Russia, but at least Russia is practical and is thinking about the sort of core issues like energy and being able to turn the lights on, which the West seems to be seen as failing people in the region. But I think, again, any sort of oppositional politics, if it's not NGOisation as a problem, you've got that problem. It's very much in the shadow of a sort of Brussels or Washington versus Moscow. So you had the recent elections in Montenegro, which were being described in terms of NATO 1, Russia 0, in terms of the election results, and it all being focused around the questions of NATO membership.
I'm interested in what the EU will do if your optimism about the Polish government, for example, or lack of optimism perhaps about Hungary, isn't correct. The EU is already facing challenges in countries like Greece, as the economic requirements for entry are now seen to be were either never there in the first place or are falling apart as to what you do with a failing economic state within the EU. What do you do when you see countries where the various requirements about protection of civil liberties and freedom of speech are also being undermined by the government? How long does the EU stick with it? Do they try and change it? Or does there come a point when the EU has to say, actually, you're no longer supporting and upholding EU values and we have to seek to expel you?
Okay. I just want to remind you that you don't need to be an absolute expert on Eastern European affairs to ask questions, because we talked about experts earlier today, but it's just, I think the question of Brexit was very interesting. So to see the links between Western and Eastern Europe, I'd like to encourage you to think about that, to see maybe what unites us and what common phenomena do we have. So a lot of people were surprised that the Brexit happened in Britain. You said it's the most democratic country, or the country with the longest democratic tradition, which is true, yes. But it was a surprise to many people, and we could say, well, there's a speculation which country will come next, and it might well be a Eastern European country. So, there are certain things which might unite us. You would say no?
No, I'll say.
Okay.
They're not going to be East European country. And this is a major difference. East European, and this is important if you see, it's not about opinion polls and others. Eastern Europe has many resentments towards the European Union, but Eastern European small countries does not have a major alternative. And from this point of view, they can stay, they can complain. There's going to be a lot of game within the European Union. We can paralyze the Union, but we're not going to get out. And this is, I do believe this is a major distinction. So from this point of view, there is a major difference between being Euro-pessimistic and being Euro-skeptical. Eastern Europe is not Euro-skeptical.
Yeah. Okay, that's an interesting point. Łukasz, Joan made that point right at the beginning. First of all, maybe we should answer the question which was asked here about what will the EU do and what will happen. But the second thing is, Joan made the point that some Eastern European states are also playing sort of a double-edged game. On the one hand, they like to take the funds of the EU and have had quite a lot of substantial amounts sent to them as subsidy payments. On the other hand, there is this very strong kind of feeling, we'd like to be a bit more independent. I find that very strongly when I speak to people in Germany. And my answer is often, West Germans complain about that immensely. And I say to them, well, what you're saying is, we're paying, so they have to do what we want. Is that the kind of attitude we'd like to have? So what would you say about that then?
Well, when somebody says that we need to be more independent from Europe in Poland, the question is, what do you really mean? And that's the first thing. And the second, is really Europe the force that is holding you back with something? What it is, one thing that you wanted to do and Brussels told you no. Like, what is it? Do you want to introduce new social policy? And Brussels said no, because what? Because they hate poor people in Brussels? I don't know. It's like, what do you want? What do you want to achieve? And Brussels told you not to do. I don't really get that, and I never got. Maybe you could answer me that question, because I don't really know the answer. The second thing is not only Europe which limits, because obviously the power of governments is now hugely limited due to many factors, due to the fact that we are members of many trade agreements, not only within the European Union, due to the fact that most of the expenses in most of the countries are how do you call it in English, like, you cannot touch them because there are long-term commitments. So the leeway that the politicians have is much smaller than it used to be. So this is, I guess, the blame game that you put on Europe is kind of, as somebody said here, I think, a way to explain our own inability to act. Kaczynski calls it, I don't know if there's impossibilism. That the politicians are struck with impossibilism, and he's gonna overcome that. But now, after a year in power, you can already see that the world doesn't work the way he wants it to work, and he already hit the wall, which is called reality. So when you criticize, that's always fine, and I do believe that the model of the European Union as we know it is probably at its end, and it's gonna change. My point is that I want to be there when the change happens. That's the first thing. And the second point, when you criticize, you have to offer some kind of alternative. And building, the only alternative we've heard in Poland as far as foreign policy is concerned, is the building of a new kind of alliance of the Central European countries. But as many people have already mentioned, is that those countries are so different in terms of every major aspect of policy, that there is no way there can be some kind of alternative. There is hardly anything that unifies them apart from the reluctance to accept migrants. And I also like the question about Russia and Ukraine. I don't really know. I mean, that's what I meant when I said that we don't have any alternative. It's either Russia or the West, or Germany, or Brussels, whatever you call it. And I don't really, and I, yeah.
That shows the whole
no, because we once had an interview with a Eurosceptic from here, John Gray, who said that if he were Polish and he had that choice between Germany and Russia, he would definitely go with the Germany. So I'm with him on it.
They had bad experience when they did that one.
Yeah.
However, I don't have an answer to your question, because that scares a lot of me as well, what is happening in Ukraine. And I think that shows that the only alternative is to go to the West. And the last comment, it's just, I don't really understand how Vladimir Putin can be seen as the protector of the conservative values by anyone in the West or wherever, because there is this great book by Peter Pomerantsev, Nothing is Real, Everything is Possible, which shows exactly that Putin is nothing about conservative values. It's just about, it's about the show. He's the probably most postmodern politician in Europe right now. So this is a con. This is a trick that he somehow defends conservative values. And especially if you look at the statistics in Russia, statistics on abortion, on divorce rate, or any other thing that is not necessarily conservative, you will see that they exceed in that.
All right. Okay. Yes.
Since we've mentioned World War III, I would like to ask Professor Krastev, does he think that Putin is going to do something foolish in the Baltic states and try to humiliate the West?
You've been talking a lot about Jarosław Kaczyński, a man who is not a president, he's not a prime minister, he's not really in government. Well, okay. Well, so what does it say about Polish democracy right now?
Okay, good question. Can I see, are there any Eastern Europeans, including East Germans and including Austrians in this audience? Hands up, please. Oh, yes, there. Yeah, okay, that's what okay. That's also fine, yeah? Even if you're American, you're allowed to ask a question in this session. So Go on.
Okay, I'm not Eastern European, but I have a question. Talking particularly about Poland and Hungary at the moment, it seems we have quite an unbalanced political situation in as much as the left-wing parties have more or less become close to irrelevant. That's maybe overstating the point a bit in the case of Hungary, but I don't think it is in the case of Poland. Do you see, what sort of prospect of intellectual and political renewal, what sort of trends do you foresee in the years ahead? Is there a hope, is there a possibility of some kind of revival of something coming out of that left? Or is it the case that maybe the situation in Poland and Hungary is something of a precursor for what we may be experiencing in the UK and other parts of Western Europe in the years ahead?
So I'm going to bring the panel in to, to answer all open questions and to sum up, and I'm going to do that in the... Joan, yeah.
Okay.
You want to answer the questions, or...?
Yeah, I'll try to. There's so many. Will Putin do something silly in the Baltics? No, he won't. I know there's been lots of television programs and all our clients asking us to do scenarios about this sort of thing, but I don't think that's likely at all. There obviously is a big reaction to what happened in Ukraine, in Eastern Europe, when Putin, in doing that, in the annexation, did cede the moral high ground that he'd previously tried to establish on intervention. And that has provoked a reaction in the Balts, in Romania, in Poland, in Sweden, in Finland, in other places as well. And everybody's suddenly spending a lot more money, defense spending. The US missile shield has been activated in Romania. Relations, obviously, between the US and Russia have reached an all-time low, well, at least for 30 years. There's been a relentless rise in NATO and Russian military exercises, frightening number of near accidents taking place. There's been a renuclearization of defense planning, and that is quite worrying, actually, and what Putin is saying at the moment about military doctrine, saying if they found themselves on the losing end of a conventional war, they would use nuclear weapons to defend Russia's security. Both sides use displays of military power to signal their resolve to the other side. So there's a danger of tensions and conflict spiraling out of control. And I don't think we can be complacent about that. And, I think maybe the Central Europeans are an easier target, really, to for the EU to have a go at than the Russians. I agree with Ivan that no East European country is going to be leaving at the moment. In the short to medium term, it's more likely to be a West European country. As long as the EU really was the only game in town, the East Europeans were actually prepared to surrender some of their sovereignty and independence in the process of becoming EU member states. As the whole EU project has started to crumble, that's no longer the case. And I think that they will be increasingly asserting their right to national sovereignty. And I don't think there's anything much that Brussels can do about it, given the overall context. I don't think they are really going to go very far. We've seen this in the past. They didn't do anything with Orban. I don't think they're really going to slap sanctions on Poland. They've got too many problems on they're facing multiple crises. They've still got Greece, they've got the migrant crisis, they've got Brexit to deal with. We've got one election after another where populist insurgents are challenging in France, in the Netherlands, in Germany next year. So I don't think they're going to take any action that's going to actually exacerbate some of these tensions or bring them to the surface. They're trying to avoid it, and I think that means that we are going to see more unraveling, because the whole EU project is just going to be seen to be completely discredited, incapable of actually standing up for what it believes in. Nobody really knows any longer what it does believe in beyond kind of diktats imposing on small states. So I think, the trend definitely is towards more disintegration. On Russia and Trump and so on, I think it's actually completely rational that Putin is supporting Donald Trump. I mean, traditionally, the Russians have supported the Republican Party. And I think the main point is that they detest Hillary Clinton. They are, and it's completely understandable. She's an intervention maniac. She's by far. I mean, Trump is unpredictable. I don't think he's rational. He's unpredictable, maybe, but his line has actually been against interventionism. I think it absolutely makes sense that Putin, there's no need to look at any other kind of conspiracy theories why they'd be supporting him over Hillary Clinton. It's totally rational.
All right. I've just seen one more hand. Make it very, very short, because I do need to get the...
As an American, I think it's a little deeper.
See, I knew we'd have an American here. All right.
With the Russians supporting Trump, I agree with you. They obviously like that he talks about NATO in this fashion, but I think it's more that he's a walking, talking repudiation of the notion that America is a great country. He's just a clown and a laughingstock, and he makes America look silly and stupid. And it plays into this narrative, yeah, we're bad in Moscow, we're corrupt, that's fine, but look at these idiots across the Atlantic. How can you trust them? And so I think that's why they want chaos, they want division, they want cynicism, and they want people to not look at America like they used to. And I really think that's the reason why there's been this overt Russian support for him.
Okay, so I'm going to bring the speakers in to sum up in the reverse order, which means that I'll start with Ivan. And there were also some questions directed to you, which haven't yet been answered.
Just on three very brief points. One is just to understand how the relations to Brussels change in Central and Eastern Europe as a result to the migration crisis on the level of the public. You should keep in mind something which you can see in every Eurobarometer over the long period of time. The major difference between particularly North and the East was that in countries like Germany or Sweden, people always trusted their national governments more than Brussels. And they trusted European Union to the extent that they trust their national governments to be influential there. In Eastern Europe, and it's also true for countries like Greece, Brussels was always trusted more than the national governments. And the logic is also simple. We don't know what they're doing. They cannot be worse than ours. So from a certain point of view, it was mistrust towards the national political class that was very much the sources to trust in Brussels. With the migration crisis, the logic changed. Not that we believe that ours are better, but we do believe that ours cared more about us. And this is a major change. It does not mean that we're ever going to have a referendum to leave, but it is a change. It is not something to be ignored. Secondly, going on the opposition story, I very much agree with your analysis, but there is even one more important argument, and this is that this is a classical Hirschman exit, voice, and loyalty. Open borders make it most difficult for people, if you live in Hungary and you really dislike how the country develops. You have two options. One is to become active in an opposition party, to organize this and that, to protest. The other is to go to London. Which one is more rational if you want a radical change? The problem with the open borders and national politics is that now, if you want to change, better change the country than change the government. And this logic, especially for the younger people, which we normally expect to be the one that stay, has an incredible impact. For countries like Bulgaria, 10% of the population left after 1989. In the Baltic countries, we're talking even bigger numbers. I do believe that migration outside of Eastern Europe is the least studied political factor in how the politics has been basically developed. And now going to the Russians, I'm flying to Moscow from here. And this is quite interesting because in order to understand basically, and this is a very also difficult moment, because the Russians manage also to buy themselves in their own propaganda. The level of apocalyptic talk in Russia is very high. For example, Soviets are never going to speak nuclear power easily. Nuke was the unspeakable. You know that you have it, it is real, but you don't speak about it. Now people basically they speak about nuclear power in the way you speak about the children party. And I do believe that this is kind of a very difficult moment because Russia is an important player, but much weaker in many terms than the Soviet Union was. President Putin was extremely successful from a very weak position to position the country to become relevant. But he better than anybody knows the weakness of his fundamental position. Its economy, it is basically institutions, and also listen, Russia is a difficult country. It is a big place. It's not Bulgaria, it's not even Romania. You're talking about ethnically very diverse place. We're talking a place with almost 20% of the Muslim population. We talk about the processes that are very much there. And while everybody is very much interested in Syria, please start to read. There was, by the way, the Economist report on Russia was a very interesting one, the last one. It's really a good one. There are major changes going within the country. For the first time, the President Putin sent a signal that loyalty is not enough. He started basically to separate with some of his closest friends from the very beginning simply because they're totally ineffective. And I'm saying this because it is the relative weakness of both Russia and the United States in the present moment that makes situations so difficult. Both of them feel weak, and there is nothing more dangerous than basically weakened great power that should make a point.
Don't know what to start. Well, maybe the easiest. I think the easiest one is the position of Jarosław Kaczyński in Poland, who is simply a member of parliament, but who is still the most important person in the. Excuse me.
He's the leader of the.
He is the leader, but like formally, he is just an MP. So I think this is one of the dysfunctions which will lead this party to be ousted out of the government, is this micromanagement kind of style that he applies. It's really, in one of the tabloids, ran a story, a front page story, saying that there was a wife of the MP who came to see the chairman, as he is called, because the guy was cheating on her. You know, this is kind of micromanagement that Kaczynski applies, and he really wants to oversee every domain of governance.
Did it work?
No, this is not to cause him to stop, just to make it go away because it was appearing in the press. So I don't know if Kaczynski. It's probably Kaczynski who summoned her in order to just cover the whole story. But this is so absurd that it shows you that this cannot work like that. And it's obviously because also Kaczynski doesn't trust people. And his style of management is that he juxtaposes people who he knows either don't like each other or have different views on certain issues. So it just cannot work in the long run. What does it say about Polish democracy? I don't know. It's reasonable from his point of view. He has such a huge negative electorate that if he was elected, if he became the prime minister, the party would go down even faster than that. I hope it will. So it's just a rational political kind of calculation on his part.
I want to come back to my point about Western Europe not existing through Germany, because we haven't talked about Germany quite enough. It was mentioned once. But so when Russia did this aggression against the Ukraine, I mean, in Hungary, we don't have a very good historical situation of Russia being on the borders that haven't worked out the best in most cases. So the initial reaction was a very visceral, very historic anti-Russian reaction. Now, when the unified foreign policy of the European Union, led by Ms. Mogherini, could achieve was the economic sanctions, this kind of, visceral anti-Russian reaction went a little down. Then, when we found out that a couple of Western European countries were still shipping arms to Russia, even though this was the case, that, went even more down. And now that we found out about Nord Stream 2, which Germany is going to approve against European Union regulation, I mean, who are we kidding, seriously? So we can push Hungary to be, again, this is the 60th anniversary of 1956, so we can start throwing stones at the Russian tanks again. I mean, I'll do that. But I don't think that really is, a very logical thing to ask of the Eastern European nations when Nord Stream 2 is happening and the Russian gas weapon is not being dismantled, but being reinstituted into Europe. So I think that is a prime example of why Western Europe doesn't exist. The other issue, and I want to mention this whole Szydło, do I pronounce her correctly? The Prime Minister Szydło? Szydło, yeah. I think this is just an experience. The lady who knows the Croatian political situation best.
Sorry, you lost me. It's Szydło.
Szydło. See, I knew I pronounced it in a bad way. Yeah, Beata. Yeah, anyway. So in Croatia, you had Jadranka Kosor, prime minister for a while, who was also seen as a puppet of a previous prime minister who went to jail because of an Austrian corruption case, Western Europe #2. But then, it was said she's just a puppet, and then she turned out and kind of like changed the political system. So I don't think we should underestimate anyone who becomes prime minister, and maybe the relationship will change differently. And I find it actually not talking about this panel, but for example, in the Hungarian media, that they don't call it the Szydło government is rather part of this larger sexist discourse in Hungary, in my opinion. Two last points, very, very short. You asked to give an example of something that we wanted, Europe didn't allow, and then, I can give you an example of something better, something the EU tried to push down everyone's throat, and this wasn't an East-West issue, and failed, and I think we should talk about it, is TTIP-CETA, which just managed to not go through. So, I mean, that's Europe. That's the European Union that we all really strive for, is this European Union with a secretive trade deal that was extremely undemocratic and the people didn't really like it, but it failed. So I think that's the positive note we can end on.
Okay. On Russia, I think there's an overemphasis on the attraction of Russia in Eastern Europe for some of these countries, even the ones that are notionally more sympathetic to Russia. Most ordinary people in Eastern Europe do not see Russia as a pole of attraction at all. The problem, I think, is more that the EU project is increasingly not a pole of attraction either for so many people, and has proved itself to have been a failure in many respects. I think it is certainly definitely worth talking about two separate regions, East and West, even if we identify within Eastern Europe very different, subgroups. There is a distinctive historical experience there, economic transition and political experience as well. But I think what's come out of this discussion really is, to a large extent, we are seeing a common pattern, in similar processes running in parallel. And like I said at the beginning, I think much of what is happening in Eastern Europe is just a more extreme version of what is happening in the West. And, we either have completely dysfunctional morass of politics in places like Romania and even Bulgaria, which went through this very difficult period, or we have these kind of authoritarian strongmen, micromanagers. Vucic in Serbia is just like Kaczynski as well. And Djukanovic never been out, his party never out of power. Unbelievable. All this time in Montenegro. And very, quite regressive trends, obviously, in terms of functioning of democracy, attacks on the media, and so on, and the complete utter absence of opposition. And for young people in this region, you either migrate or you certainly don't really get involved in politics, because people are just so cynical about politics. So it's good that we have two young men and one slightly older one here who are involved in politics in the region. And I think it's the same. It is quite dispiriting to look at what is going on, but I think the same as here, it's about actually confronting the EU about what, in the values debate, and what we really stand for. And if you don't like what Viktor Orban and Kaczynski are doing, do something about it and get involved and engage in this contestation, that has, ground that has been vacated really by an opposition in Eastern Europe.
Okay, that was a nice end. So thank you very much for coming to this session. Let's give our speakers a big round of applause.